This was sort of forecast. We talked about how unusual this is, but actually there was a very smart man in 1962 who wrote a book called The Image, The History of the Pseudo-Event in American Politics. Daniel Boorstin, later the Librarian of Congress, famous American historian. And he said in 1962, after the Kennedy-Nixon election, that the changing nature of the American media, which he thought was corroding a lot of the traditional sources of authority in our society, and the weakening of the party structure meant that in the future we were less likely to nominate for office people who had demonstrated straight statecraft. They'd been a successful governor or mayor or senator or congressman. Instead, we would tend to begin to pick people who are famous simply because they were famous. And we've done that. We picked somebody who had never served in office, whether in the military or in public office, and who basically used the media on his behalf to disrupt the existing political structure and the existing political system. It took a little bit of while for Daniel Boorstin's idea to come off, but it has come off in a splendidly amazing fashion tonight.
You know, we talked about the numbers, and we talked about them all night, Chris, and we've been talking about them for months, and the pollsters and so on. One of the things we watched for months was this LA Times poll.
Yeah.
To see whether they were the only ones who had it right. They've had Trump ahead by 6 points for months.
Yep.
And they polled the same group of people. It was a huge group, but they kept going back to the same group, that same group, over and over and over and over and over.
So he's
Does
up.
this validate that method of polling?
No. So he's up a point in the national popular. Our final poll had her up 3 in the national popular. The average of polls was 2.5, 3 points. It was the national polling had settled around her up by 3 points, 3 points. He's up by a point in the popular, but as Joe was saying earlier, by the time we get done count and vote in California, it's going to be pretty close to a tie. The problem that we have as consumers of politics is that we don't see these numbers for what they are. These numbers are suggestions about a zone. This is a shotgun pattern, not a rifle shot. So you put up this scatter shot and you say, it's over here. But him winning by 1 point, we were talking about this the other day. Him winning by 1 point or her winning by 4 points were about or 5 points was about as equally likely any of them inside that space.
Yeah, that's why we need to pay attention at all times to margins of error.
Yeah.
And these findings, you know, this turns out the way you just outlined, Chris, that would be within the margin. Let me make a point about one other thing that I didn't notice. Maybe you all have mentioned it, but this election might mean the revival of the white vote, and the white voters in this election behaved like a minority group. They stuck together to a great extent. And I didn't realize this, but white non-college graduates, we all expected Trump would do great. According to the exit polling, he won them 67-28. White college graduates, Trump wins by 4. So he won the white vote across the board.
They came home.
Less and more educated alike. They came home to him. They stuck with him. Yes, they're down to 70% of the electorate, but they're still by far the biggest complement of our electorate.
I'd say 2 things. One is, remember, he's going to be a minority president. In fact, he's reminiscent of, we've had a guy just like this before. James A. Garfield got elected nationwide, won the Electoral College, got a minority, won the plurality of the popular vote, and his nationwide majority was less than 2,000 votes. I mean, we're going to have a guy who comes into office who better have a little humility tonight. Sure, he's had an extraordinary victory, but he will enter office with less than 50% of the vote, and he may end up either with her in the popular vote or behind her in the popular vote.
Well, if he does, remember this, and I remember this was said about the man for whom you work, that he didn't get 50% of the vote, but he got 100% of the presidency.
That's right. And I hope to God the Republicans who, the Democrats who said those things about George W. Bush not being the legitimately elected president of the United States will not hurt our country by saying those things about him if he happens to win the Electoral College and come in.
You suggest, Britt, that he was able to bring the white vote together. I think he had a lot of sort of nationalist white appeal that has brought out some extreme elements in our society. I worry about that as part of this. And then you said, well, but he tomorrow could express some degree of humility, some grace, some willingness to reach out to Americans who are somewhat put off, if not in total shock at what has happened here tonight. But again, I just don't see any evidence of that in a man that I have watched very closely over the course of this campaign. I see him as someone who holds grudges, pursues those grudges, says I'm going to lock up my opponents. And that scares me. I tell you.
Well,
This is the moment we all ought to suspend judgment.
Yeah, exactly right.
Wait and see how he acts. Don't prejudge him. This country has survived elections before in which there were bitterness far beyond the measure of what we've seen in this election. But it all is incumbent upon us to give him a chance to succeed.
Yeah, remember one, Herb Block, the famous liberal cartoonist at the Washington Post, editorial cartoonist. When Richard Nixon was elected president, he had savaged Nixon, and he always portrayed him with a deep, 5 o'clock shadow, and made him look very sinister. And he had a drawing in which he was sitting in the barber chair, and Herb Block gave him a clean shave. Let's hope the country is willing to give Donald Trump.
But when you hear about banning Muslims,
this is the very kind of thing, intolerance. Richard Nixon played very rough with people, accusations that they were communists and all that. Let the guy have a fresh start.
Here's the question, Dana. Is the Donald Trump we saw on the campaign trail, who got a lot of coverage and said a lot of controversial things, is he the Donald Trump we're going to see as possibly president-elect and the 45th president of the United States?
I think probably not, because while they will celebrate, it is also one of those moments that will definitely sober the mind, in that you will now be, if he wins, Commander-in-Chief of the United States of America. You are the leader of the free world. And that, to me, is a sobering moment, in that you realize the weight of that responsibility, that the buck stops there. I don't know all the other things in terms of the tweeting and such like that. I don't know what they're going to do. Technology has changed so much, even from when I was in the White House press office. I didn't even have a Twitter account until I left there. So the way by which they communicate is very interesting. I would say that when I was press secretary, I would try to split the job in two. 50% of my time was spent advocating and defending the President of the United States of America, and the other 50% was used to defend and advocate for access of members of the press to the government. And this has been a campaign that has really focused on the media, the so-called bias of it, questioning media, calling them out, and I hope that is one thing that he decides to really think about, is that our country survives based on the free press, and the press is going to have to figure out a way to cover him fairly if he were to take office.
But let's be honest. We don't have, you asked a very good question. Is the President Trump, if he is elected, if he gets these final 16 electoral votes, is he going to be different than candidate Trump? And the only answer you can really give is who the hell knows. And I don't know that he necessarily knows, but let's face it, he's a 70-year-old billionaire who pulled off the most improbable victory in the history of our country. I'm not sure that humility and a feeling of, gee, I got to change the way I do business is necessarily going to be at the top of his agenda. He may think, you know what, I'm smarter than all these guys.
It worked out okay for me.
You may be right, Chris, and you probably are, but I hope he doesn't think that way, because the man who got elected is less the man who campaigned up to and through October 22nd, and more the man who campaigned from October 23rd till today. October 22nd is when he goes to Gettysburg, makes a speech that's pretty good substantively, but opens with 14 minutes excoriating the women who had accused him of groping them. And that was the last day that he conducted himself like that. Since then, he's been a reasonably contained, disciplined candidate.
Stay cool, Donald. Stay cool.
And you know who told him that? Reince Priebus. Those words that he said on that podium, I have it on good authority, were the last words that Reince Priebus said to him before he left to go back to Washington for one day to change his clothes, get a new set of underwear, and go back on the campaign.
How many Hollywood stars?
Priebus is underwear.
But we're not, you mentioned the women who accused him, who Donald Trump says he's going to sue. And, we question this. Is a sitting president of the United States going to sue a bunch of women who presumably that threat dies if he wins the presidency? But something we haven't discussed is the number of groups who are likely feeling real fear right now, in a way that perhaps they hated Hillary Clinton, they didn't want Hillary Clinton, but they weren't afraid of her. I mean, you've got Muslims who may be feeling that way tonight. You've got women. You've got women who, have seen him accused of groping women against their will, matters which have not been resolved in his favor or against him. They remain unresolved, and people can make up their own minds about it. We've got a history of comments that Trump has made, which are sexist in nature. They may be booing, but this is true. You've got immigrants who have been threatened by Donald Trump with deportation.
Hispanics.
You call them thieves and rapists? I mean, I'm glad you're saying this because, everyone's saying give it a new start, let it go, take it easy. But I just remind you that even for Republicans, what you heard from Sean Hannity tonight about go after Paul Ryan, he won't be speaker. This suggests to me, this is about disruption of a political process. And on that level, I can appreciate disruption. But when it becomes so personal, you feel personally, wait a second, this is someone who has said, most white people in the country are killed by black people. Something that's an outright lie, not true, never taken it back. Someone who says that I can grab women as I please, never takes it back, never apologizes.
No,
Monica?
That's not true.
He apologized for the bus
I did
comment.
apologize that. Monica?
Yeah, may I? Look, Donald Trump, I think, understands the import of this moment. I also think he understands the importance of an inclusive message of change tonight and going forward. Britt mentioned President Nixon, for whom I worked during his last years. And I remember having a conversation with President Nixon about Election Day 1968. And I asked him, after you voted, Mr. President, how did you feel? What were you thinking? And he said, you know what, Monica, I wasn't thinking whether or not I was going to win that night. I was thinking as I drove around in my car, watching people line up to vote, how many of them did I reach? And I think tonight, Donald Trump is absorbing not just the job, which the job will change you, but the magnitude of the responsibility of that job. He has spoken repeatedly over the last several weeks in his closing argument about wanting to be a president for all of the people. And I think what you're going to start to hear from him starting tonight and going forward is this inclusive message of change, bringing the country together, what is at stake, why it matters, and how he is now uniquely positioned to make it happen.
Brit Hume could hardly have been more right when he said that every American, especially every American of faith, owes their prayers, good wishes, and support to Donald Trump if, in fact, he does become the president-elect tonight. That is the sacred duty and obligation of every American to hope that their leader is successful, is wise, and brings peace and prosperity to the country. But it is also incumbent on the supporters of that president-elect, and it is also incumbent on that president-elect to reach out to those individuals who do feel frightened, who do feel marginalized, to bind up those wounds in the other direction. If we're going to be burying hatchets, which we need to do a lot of in this country, a great deal of, both sides have earth to turn over.
I will just say that this looks like, at this moment, the highest evangelical vote we have seen in decades.
Which is unbelievable if you think about it. Somebody wrote an article earlier this week talking about how what does that do for the Republican Party on a go-forward basis? Because there had been an assumption that you had to be, strongly pro-life. You had to take certain positions when it comes to gay marriage or gay rights, abortion and so on. So what does this mean now?
Well, Chris, what he said in that debate was a powerful message to evangelicals when there was the question you asked about abortion and the different policy from the two candidates. And I think perhaps that struck a chord in that final pitch.
Yeah, absolutely, and particularly when it got to the question of partial birth abortion. I mean, the interesting fact is that Trump is, on social issues, particularly by Republican standards, very moderate. He, at one point, espoused the idea of allowing transgender people to use whichever bathroom they wanted. He
was once in favor of partial birth abortion. He said he wouldn't ban it.
Right. Okay.
But if your two choices are Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump,
right.
and you're an evangelical voter.
But I'm just saying that he's not your typical, I mean, when you think of George W. Bush or Ronald Reagan, he's not your typical evangelical Republican politician.
But he's proven that you can get the Republican nomination, right? This is something for those moderate Republicans out there who aren't so keen on Donald Trump. He has proven that you can get the Republican nomination, you can win the presidency potentially, even if you don't subscribe to the more conservative social views, which, listen, he's sort of paid some lip service to it today, but he's had a lifelong history as a Democrat and as somebody who is more liberal socially. And he said a lot of the right things for the Republican once he secured the nomination and was running. But the truth is that doctrine has been busted up as well by Donald Trump.
We're coming up to the top of the hour, and we are waiting on a few states. The biggest, Michigan and Pennsylvania. Stay with Fox News Channel for continuing coverage of the 2016 presidential election.
Look at the crowd outside of the Fox News headquarters. Remember that time we said we thought we'd be able to make a call by 11, and the early exit polls looked like that call would probably go to Hillary Clinton? Not so much. We are watching right now states including Michigan, which has been too close to call, Pennsylvania, which has been too close to call, New Hampshire, Minnesota, Maine, Arizona. None of those has come in, and we started the evening saying Trump needed to pull an inside straight. Shoes on a very different foot now, mixing metaphors, but she needs an inside straight, and it should be, ideally it would be a flush as well, straight flush. It's going to be hard, is my point. And a new pair of shoes, which everyone always needs, no matter what. Going to toss it up to Brett, who's with Bill Heimer at the data deck upstairs.
Yes, the data deck. And we are looking at some cards for Hillary Clinton that do not look like they're lining up for
I
her.
think I told you earlier today I'd see you at 1 o'clock in the morning.
That's true.
But I think we're supposed to be at the bar.
Yes, that's right. There are casinos in Michigan. Show us some Michigan.
Here's what I've been watching for the last 30 minutes, okay? 30 minutes ago, Trump's margin was about 34,000 in Michigan. And then it bumped up to 42,000. And then
so these are remaining counties.
Correct, yeah, northern Michigan. Then it bumped up to 59,000. My point is, every time you watch it, maybe it's 5,000, Brett, maybe it's 10, maybe it's 2,000.
But right now it's 50.
Correct. Yeah, 59. Did it change again?
No, 51.
Oh, boy. I mean, I gave up math when I got an iPhone.
There you go. Okay, 59.
So let me take you to Pennsylvania here, and this is what's happened over the last 30 minutes. At 12:30 East Coast time, he was up 26,000 votes. 15 minutes later, he was up 35,000 votes in Pennsylvania. And right now, based on that board, it's 52. Okay, it had been 59. It came down about 5,000. So you're at 52,000 vote margin there in the state of Pennsylvania.
So either one of those states obviously puts him over the top of 270 electoral votes to win. She has to find the votes there in Michigan or Pennsylvania. Otherwise, because Minnesota doesn't do it alone, Arizona is still out here, but it's a Republican-leaning state.
But let me show you that, too, by the way, in Arizona, because at the moment he's got about a 4-point lead right now. You know, you go back 4 years ago and you see what the margin was between, Romney and Obama. It was much greater. She's closed the gap as a Democrat, but again, he still has the advantage. So we go back to the what-if column yet again, and, okay, take Michigan out of the picture. Take Pennsylvania out. If he's at 254 right now confirmed, Arizona puts him at 265. New Hampshire is too close to call. Have you seen what's going on in that state? I mean, it is just so razor tight. I'll take you there right now, and we can see the margin here. I mean, this has gone 0.2% in his favor, 0.2% in her favor.
All right, let me do one thing.
Yeah.
Let me do one thing on this what if. What if, let's go back here, and what if, okay, what if she pulls out the miraculous win in Michigan?
And Pennsylvania.
And Pennsylvania. She's at 251. Now, Minnesota looks like it's heading her way, 261. All right, you have to give Arizona to
likely
to Donald Trump. So then you have Alaska that goes
it just
Republican.
It just closed a minute ago.
Okay, let's just say it goes Republican. 268. Then you have the presidency of the United States hanging on New Hampshire, which, by the way, is tight. Right?
Very tight. Could go either way. And
right here? Well, let's see where it is. Right now, you have Clinton up in New Hampshire.
Yeah. No, it's Maine.
Oh, that would be why. That's why. See, that's why Bill does it and I don't do it.
Okay. It's another shot
big
there.
Fingers.
Take two.
There we go. Okay. And you have, again, Clinton up in New Hampshire.
by about 1,000 votes. Click back to 2012 on the bottom right there.
I'm going to give you back control. My point is that it is conceivable that the entire presidency of the United States comes down to New Hampshire, the first in the nation primary
I only
state.
point this out because it's 650,000 votes from 4 years ago. Okay, from 2016, we are well under that mark right now. So you've got 520,000 votes in right now. You're going to get more vote in, and whether or not, well, she just jumped up 0.7%. I mean, that's what we're debating right now, trying to figure this out. 0.7% of the entire vote for the states. But it's pretty simple this way, Brett. You win Michigan,
Boom.
you're at the number.
That's it.
It's pretty easy this way.